Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Money, Lecture 21. My name is Professor Barth, and we are continuing forward with our study of the history of the United States dollar. There she is. Old Glory, the 15-star flag. The 13 original states and Vermont and Kentucky were added shortly after. Tennessee will be the 16th state, added in 1796, but this is a 15-star flag. And you'll recall from the last lecture we discussed at length this debate that erupts between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton emerges as a de facto leader of the Federalist Party, Jefferson as the de facto leader with Madison of the Democratic Republicans. And it appears in the year 1800 that the Democratic Republicans have won the day. The Federalists are handed a defeat. They lose the House of Representatives. They lose the White House. They retain their hold over the judiciary and a slight lead in the Senate, but even that goes away. As in fact, actually, the Federalist Party goes extinct. Hamilton is killed in a duel in 1804. And the Democratic Republicans dominate American politics for the next 2 decades. Nevertheless, Hamilton's vision of a decidedly commercial, industrial, proto-industrial, financial future of the United States ends up being quite prescient, because in the decades after the 1790s, the U.S. embarks on what historians have described as being a market revolution. The market revolution. And there I have approximate dates. This isn't a revolution in sort of the French Revolution sense, where there's a date where it begins and you can pinpoint, 1789 as the exact date. No, not exactly. These are approximations. But generally in this first half of the 19th century, a period of extraordinary growth, economic growth in the new American Republic. Intense commercialization, entrepreneurship. In other words, with regard to entrepreneurship, organizing and managing a business, but at considerable risk. And the only reason why you would take that risk is because of the potential for profit. There were many people, entrepreneurs, who made great profit in this period. There were also an untold number of Americans, entrepreneurs, who failed and did not succeed. But a burst in entrepreneurship, burst in commerce, American society becomes very highly commercial, producing goods for market, goods for export, goods for commercial profit. New technologies emerge. We'll look at a couple of those today, but we won't look at all of them, of course. New industries, new opportunities for investment, so ways to utilize your capital and reservoirs for capital, places for people to take their capital and invest it. All of these things are on the rise. GDP. Economic output doubled in this country every 15 years during this period. Think about that. Doubled every 15 years. Per capita income rose a little more than 1% every year in the first half of the 19th century. Now that might seem small, just barely more than 1%. If you think about it, over many years, that's quite an improvement. And so the standard of living on the whole increased during this period. Let's take a look at just a couple numbers. Exports in 1790, about $20 million worth of exports from the U.S. By 1807, that was up to 108 million. I stop at 1807 because in 1807, Jefferson made maybe a political miscalculation and ordered an embargo on British and French goods and foreign trade because of foreign policy blunders associated with the Napoleonic War, impressment of sailors, and all the rest. Won't go into that detail, but that's why 1807. Stop it there, because there was a period where foreign trade collapsed a little bit, but then it rebounded right back to where it was prior. But that's quite a jump. That's more than 5 times greater than 1790 within a relatively short period, within a generation. Look at this. This is even more astounding. In 1785, there were only 11 chartered corporations in the United States. By 1817, there were nearly 2,000, 1,800 chartered corporations. And when we hear that term, chartered corporations, I think many of us think of, big corporation like Amazon or Walmart. And while there were larger corporations than others during this period, many of these corporations were smaller businesses. But this is an astounding number. Again, within a generation, really. 1,800 chartered corporations. Again, avenues for investment, capital investment. Another sign of a growing economy is a growing population. Population was doubling every 20 years. Doubling every 20 years, and it was an extremely young population. The average age, the median age, was only 17 years old. Think about that. The median age was only 17 years old in America during this period. I looked up what the median age in America was during the last census in 2010, and it was 37 years old. Okay, 37 today. Back then, 17. Essentially a nation of young adults. Maybe even you may say teenagers, although the concept of being a teenager back then was quite different. When you were 17, you were an adult, and you were a full-fledged member of society. What does this create, this very young population? It is a very aggressive population, restless, hopeful, optimistic. All the different sort of traits you get with youth. Energetic, dynamic, hyper-individualistic, very, very competitive, aggressively democratic, entrepreneurial, sometimes brash, boisterous. All the positives and the negatives. But the positives are really interesting, and it created this very, very unique society. It's a very unique generation in American history. Really, there's been no generation quite like this generation that we're going to see in this lecture today, quite like this generation in American history. You had the good and the ugly, but a quite unique time in American history. It's the early national period. It is the dawn, and that American energy has been unleashed, and with all sorts of effects. This is a predominantly middle-class society. You have different degrees of wealth, obviously, but you don't quite have the rigid gradations of wealth that you see in Europe or Britain at the time. It's a lot more of not an equal distribution, but it's not as rigidly structured, the class system, or if you can even describe this as a class system. Part of the reason for this perhaps was that it was the abundance of land, which made it relatively easy compared to Europe to own your own farm. But look at this population growth. 1750, 1 million. By the ratification of the Constitution, there were about 4 million Americans. By 1820, 10 million. Look at that growth. So that by 1860, 32 million Americans. Now, roughly 15% of this population is enslaved. 15% of the population. And so that will vary. I'll have those numbers here in a minute when we look at the Southern economy briefly. And this is just a very, very, very brief survey, just to provide some context into this new period of monetary history that we're about to dive into. Many of these people move west beyond the Appalachian Mountains into Ohio country, which includes the Old Northwest, Indiana, was a bit later Wisconsin, but Indiana, Illinois, then west of North Carolina and Virginia into Kentucky and Tennessee, and then slowly into what was called the Old Southwest, into Alabama, Mississippi. This is an overwhelmingly agricultural and rural society. In 1810, only 6% of the population lived in cities. Only 6%, so 94% lived in rural settings. That barely improved by 1830. 1830, if you consider it an improvement, some, like Jefferson, would say it's a declension. But by 1830, 12% of the American population lived in cities, and 88% lived in rural areas. But you do have some urbanization. Even out west, Cincinnati is founded during this period. St. Louis, Memphis, Chicago all get their early beginnings during this period. There's Ohio country. In Ohio country, a wheat boom takes off, and there's a lot of money to be made in exporting wheat, not only to markets elsewhere in the United States, although that too, but also to Europe. Europe was just bogged down in warfare from the 1790s all the way up through 1815 with Napoleon and all the rest, and this led to a great demand in Europe for agricultural imports. Well, this area of the United States, of course, is very conducive for that type of agriculture, and so there's a boom in wheat exports from Pennsylvania in the Ohio country to Europe. This area of the country is sometimes nicknamed the bread basket of the early national United States. And this area here in 1787, the Congress had explicitly stated that these states will be free states. There will be no slavery. And so the wheat boom, the farms there are farmed by independent yeoman families and farmers without the slave labor system. But in the south of the Ohio River, there's the Ohio River. South of the Ohio River, commercial agriculture also really takes off. These are on plantations and very, very large and extensive plantations. And the crop to really take off is cotton. King Cotton, as it was sometimes nicknamed. In Georgia, in the Old Southwest, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and South Carolina. And development is given a boost by an invention by a man named Eli Whitney in 1793 of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was a machine that allowed for the easy separation of seeds from cotton fibers, which prior to that was a very meticulous task. Before the invention of the cotton gin, an average worker could only clean about 1 pound of cotton a day. With the invention of the cotton gin, a single worker, with the aid of that machine, could clean 1,000 pounds of cotton a day. So major invention. And look at that output. 1792, just on the eve of the invention of the cotton gin, only 6,000 bales of cotton were produced in the South. By 1805, that's at 146 bales. By 1820, 334 bales, and 334,000 bales, and it will continue to go up, and up. And the cotton is exported primarily to Britain, because Britain is in the midst of an industrial revolution, especially in textile manufacture, and Britain wants cotton. And so this close relationship between the South, between cotton plantations in the southern United States, and Great Britain opens up. But also there are factories in the northern part of the United States who also want cotton and import their cotton, buy their cotton from these southern plantations. The cotton boom also gives a new boost, revitalization to the slave system, which had taken a bit of hit in the late 18th century as far as its reputation. There were many of the founding fathers, even the ones who were slaveholders, were very uncomfortable with slavery. And there was a common view, again, even among some of the slave owners, that slavery was an immoral system and that was going to die a natural death. But with the onset of the cotton boom, a new sort of belief and defense in slavery emerges. Slave markets expand within the United States, and so this is another commercial element, and there's a whole lot of money involved in the slave trade. The banking system gets pretty heavily involved in the slave trade as well, lending money to plantation owners, using slaves as collateral on a loan. So this is also another big element of the commercialization, in this case, in the southern United States. So there's the total U.S. population, there's the slave population. Reaches 4 million by 1860. Just far from dying the death that many of the founders had hoped it would, slavery expands. And then in the North more and more adopts manufacturing. This is a very gradual process. It takes a while to get there. But in New England, places like Philadelphia, New York City, textile mills begin to arise. And of course, at these mills and these factories, they rely upon a wage labor system. And they rely upon new machinery invented at first in England, like the power loom, but have now been adopted in factories within the United States. Factories, textile mills, expensive capital equipment like the power loom require lots of investment, lots of money, finance. And then there are infrastructure projects during this period. Road construction or turnpike construction. Roads are built all across the United States. And this reduced the cost of wagon hauling. Back in before the construction of these roads, it was very time-consuming and difficult to travel any sort of long distance at all. But now with the construction of roads, travel within the United States, even at long distances, is a bit easier. There were roads such as the National Road, which connected Cumberland all the way down through Ohio country to Illinois. And eventually a private road company built a turnpike that extended to Baltimore. And cities appeared, towns appeared all across this road, including Indianapolis. And then it wasn't too far of a route then to St. Louis, and then you got the Mississippi River. So internal transportation improves. Canals were built during this period, and canals were very, very capital intensive. Required lots and lots of investment, lots of money to build a canal. Canals allowed the transport of goods by water from one river to another, or alternatively, if you have a river and if you need to bypass rapids or waterfalls, you could use a canal to get around that. The most famous canal was the Erie Canal, which connected the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. The Erie Canal opened in 1825 and stretched 363 miles. There's the Erie Canal. But very, very expensive project to undertake. Now very remunerative. There was much profit to be had in operating a canal, and then as well, the economic rewards of having canals were also great. The Erie Canal basically opened up the Great Lakes region, places like Michigan, Wisconsin, for settlement and agriculture, because it was fairly easy then to ship your goods to one of the Great Lakes or to Lake Erie, and then by the Erie Canal to the Hudson River. Bam, you're at New York City, and you can transport it across the Atlantic Ocean. Steamboats get their start using the power of the steam engine, and steamboats had the advantage of being able to go upriver against the current, also travel faster. In the 1810s and especially by the 1820s, there are steamboats going up and down the Mississippi River. Prior to that, if you went down to New Orleans, you couldn't just go back upriver against the current. But now with steam boats, you can. And so this increases traffic along the Mississippi River and also opens up states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois to farming because of the ease of water transport via the Mississippi. The first steamship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and shortened the trip across the Atlantic. Prior to the steamship, it took a month and a half to go across the Atlantic Ocean. With the invention of the steamship, it took only 6 days. 10 days. I got that wrong. 10 days. 10 days to get from one end of the Atlantic to another. Now, from our perspective in the 21st century, 10 days is a very long time, but it's not a month and a half. And so that was quite a remarkable development. And internal travel within the United States just became easier in general. Prior to this, all of these innovations, it took 52 days to travel from New York City to Cincinnati. Now it takes only 6 days to travel from New York City to Cincinnati. That's where the 6 day came from in my brain. That's a huge improvement. Communication across the United States through things like the post office. 1790 there were 75 post offices. By 1830 there's more than 8,000 post offices across the United States. Newspapers. 1790 there's fewer than 100 newspapers. By 1820 there's more than 500 newspapers. It takes capital to have a newspaper, to buy the printing press and to hire staff and to arrange for distribution of your paper and all the rest. Everything we've described requires money and involves the making of a lot of money, but it requires that initial capital. And so, during this period, massive demand for banking, for finance, and for credit. Banking, finance, and credit. Americans are starving for it. They want it. They want to engage in all of these activities, but you've got to have the capital. Got to have the capital. Oh, that's the context. Alexander Hamilton all of a sudden looks sitting a little perhaps prettier than he did in the previous lecture, if you were skeptical of Hamilton. Jefferson's vision for the American Republic been, what has the market revolution done to his vision? Well, it's changed it quite dramatically, and Jefferson is not so comfortable with many of the aspects. That being said, America is still predominantly rural. It's still predominantly an agricultural country, but there's no doubt about it. This is a nation in want and in need of credit systems. And so in the next lecture, we'll take a look at just a spectacular increase in banking, paper money, and credit during this early national period in United States history. See you there.